any online people for Friday's lab, if you already have a valid, non-expired custom applicator's license, you can send it to me, and you don't need to redo the lab or something you've already done. But if it's not expired, well, here's your opportunity to go in and renew it. It wasn't expired yet. It's good for 2 years. Here it goes. Yep. December 31st. And then Jonathan interrupted me, and I can't remember what I was trying to say. It's all Jonathan's fault. I am blaming you. But anyway, so the Emporia people, y'all just drive straight to campus, Keysville people, and then Megan, are you going to meet us in South Boston? I mean, in Keysville, are you going to drive straight here, or what do you think?
I'll probably meet you on Keysville.
Okay. We'll be leaving Keysville. I'm aiming for like 8:45. That'll get us here in Alberta like 9:45. That'll give you a couple of minutes to use the bathroom and get in the hallways to find where Cynthia is, get her to this letter, kind of thing. That's the plan for this upcoming Friday. Job listings, internships, that kind of thing. I've got a few of them that I should have, I told y'all about a couple of them. I should have emailed y'all about a couple of them. But I've told y'all about the Berry Hill irrigation. They're looking to hire somebody. I got a job description from them. I can't find where it is, but they're paying pretty good money. I want to say $35, $40 a year plus commissions. I mean, it was like score. Internship opportunity for you. Let's see. It's there is a I haven't actually clicked it. Casey, did you read about that internship that Dixie emailed me about a week ago? But it has you out in Oklahoma for 10 weeks this summer. They pay you you make $4,800. They provide housing. You're in Oklahoma for 10 weeks doing agriculture stuff. So if you're interested in that, I can send you that information. Yeah, so it's 40 hours a week, $10 an hour. Oh, it's more than 10. That's $12 an hour. 40 hours each week for 10 weeks. That's 400 hours. $4,800. That's $12 an hour plus housing to be learning, doing, being. So you're not here for cheap. Are you gonna send it to everyone? I like that. Okay, I'll try to send it out to everybody to be watching the skies for that. That may have been it at this point. And the nice thing is actually, if you end up doing that one, you could actually as well submit it in to get credit for the AGR190 class. So you can do that as well. That's an internship thing. It's just a fifth class. But you know, if you need a fit ag class, that's an option for you. But I'll try to. Hopefully, I'll send that out in the next few minutes while I'm forgetting about it. Before I forget about it. Yes, English. I need to try it. Listen. Yes. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm done. So you can feel free to try it.
Okay. So I won't go over the test today because it's still open until tonight for some of the online people. So I'll wait and go over that next class period. So I don't have the averages or anything like that ready for you because we still have some online people that need to take it, and I need to finish grading the online exams. So with that, we don't have any assignments due right now. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump into the lecture for today. But just want to let you know we'll go over the test next lecture. Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, So we are in section 4 of your textbook. So if you have your book and you want to kind of read the chapters along with the lecture, I'd encourage you to do that because it probably helps explain it a little bit better than what's on the lecture slides. So today we're going to talk about animal diseases. There are a lot of different ones. We've kind of touched on some of them before a little bit in some of the specific species lectures, but we'll hit on some more today. So feel free to stop me if you have any questions. And Tom, let me know if my internet kind of goes out. I'm in the new house, and so we've got it set up, but the router is kind of a little bit farther away from my office than I would like. So just let me know if I start getting fuzzy.
Okay. Oh, 2 things. Number 1, congratulations for that. And number 2, Dixie and I were talking about you the other day, and we're like, if you have any time in classes, whatever, you actually want to go into more detail on some of these trips and stuff, and what stuff that you do as far as your job, give them an idea about what a person working in agribusiness does.
Okay.
Just sort of keep that in the back of your mind for something you can do.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I didn't know how much y'all wanted to hear about my real job, my full-time job. But yeah, I mean, I can always kind of like talk a little bit more about what I do. And I would love to do that too, because I really didn't even know that like my career path was an option until I was pretty much well into like my first year of grad school. And so I always kind of try to talk to people about it because there are so many options out there in agriculture that people don't even realize. And I tell people what I do and they're like, that's a job. I'm like, yeah, it's a job. And there's actually really high demand for it. So yeah, I might do that, at some point, like, I don't know, maybe another lecture or something. I can kind of talk about that and go over some stuff if you think that's important.
Yeah, that's cool. That's what I was telling her. I'm trying to want to get a little more production. It's hard to get production stuff in the science class, but if we, and that's kind of production.
Yeah. Yeah, I could maybe, because we're gonna have because this year it looks like we're gonna have a couple of days left over actually, because last year the lectures, remember we had like a couple classes that were canceled.
Yeah.
So I've got some room in there, so I could maybe kind of do like a lecture kind of more about my job and what it entails, and then maybe some more like production related stuff that I'm seeing in the industry, kind of things like that. If that would be interesting to anybody.
Sounds fantastic to me. I don't know about the rest of it.
And that could just be a lecture. Like, it doesn't have to be on the test. I could just kind of more of a career type information lecture.
Yeah.
Not to like provide you with more information to study. But okay, well, I'll think about that. So that'd be good. So just a quick overview of animal disease. So animal diseases are obviously a threat to the animal as well as humans, depending on the type of disease that it is. So zoonotic diseases are infectious animal diseases that can actually infect people. So they can cross the species barrier and actually infect people. So it's really important to kind of be aware of diseases in general, but especially which diseases are zoonotic, because those can cross species lines. So make sure you're familiar with that definition, obviously, bold and underline. So diseases are extremely important to be aware of because they reduce the productivity of your production system. And that's mainly going to be because depending on the disease, you could have animal mortality, which means animals are actually going to die, and then reduced productivity, which would kind of be considered morbidity, which is just basically meaning that the animals are sick. They're not to the point of death, but they're very, very sick, and they're going to be using a lot of that energy to fuel the immune system instead of to fuel growth. And so does anybody remember, throwback to your test, what the major energy source is for the body?
ATP.
ATP, right, exactly. And ATP is needed for all of the processes in the body. So if your immune cells and your immune system needs to be active, it's going to be using ATP too, and then you don't have ATP available for growth. That's kind of how that works. So diseases can kill or completely incapacitate valuable and or much loved horses and companion animals as well. Obviously, diseases can affect anything pretty much on the planet. So animal diseases can have a big impact on livestock. There are a lot of different mechanisms that you can put in place to try to combat these diseases. Those would be good management practices, good sanitation, biosecurity, which is a really, really big one. I think we hit on it a little more specific later in the lecture. But biosecurity is a big one, especially with pigs and poultry. Veterinary care, so knowing when to call a vet, monitoring and then depopping in the event of an outbreak. So that would just mean if you have a severe outbreak in, let's say, a pig farm or a chicken house, you may have to kind of just let that disease go through and then move all of those animals completely out of that facility, don't have any animals coming in there for a while so that it can be cleaned, and then kind of sit for those organisms to die and then bring new animals in after a certain period of time. Vaccines, of course, are always a good way to prevent disease. You just want to be careful about when you're giving vaccines because a lot of times if you're giving them to, like, let's say a pig at weaning, that's already a stressful event. Their immune system's already going to be challenged. So you want to be careful about when you're giving vaccines and make sure that you're giving the right vaccines. Prophylactic drugs and then therapeutic drugs, of course, are also some other options. So there have been tremendous impacts of animal disease really all over the world, in North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America specifically. Just some definitions that kind of go along with diseases and kind of the type or the categories of diseases that you may have. So epidemiology, it's got ology on there, and so basically just means like the study of something. So epidemiology is just the science of the causes, spread, and control of diseases. So it's basically just the science of diseases. And then an epidemic would be a situation where an infectious disease can spread very rapidly and cause many people or animals to become sick or show clinical symptoms. So that would be considered an epidemic disease. And so that would be like within the US or within a certain country, you would have an epidemic if a lot of people over a large area are getting sick. When it starts going between countries or between continents, it becomes a pandemic, which is an epidemic that affects a very large number of people and is occurring across the world. So pandemic would obviously be your worst case scenario. Because it's kind of going to be the next level of an epidemic because it's going to be going between countries. And it's very scary to think about these days because if you think about how many people are traveling back and forth across the world all the time, it would be very easy for a pandemic to happen, I feel like. So just be aware of those terms. So zoonosis is basically, like I talked about, zoonotic disease. It's when an infectious disease can spread from an animal to a person, and that can happen directly through a bite or by aerosol. So if that animal is coughing or sneezing and you're around it and that gets in your face, or it can happen through food or even through a vector. So a mosquito, for example, could be a vector. Sometimes like fleas or ticks or things like that can kind of be a vector to transmit it. If they bite the animal that's infected and then they bite you, they can transmit that disease if it's a zoonotic disease. So some viral diseases that would kind of fall under that category would be rabies. Obviously, you're probably aware that humans can get rabies, which is why if you see an animal that you think may have it, you want to stay away. Avian influenza, and then equine encephalitis virus. Some other bacterial diseases would be the bubonic plague, which you probably learned about a little bit in school. Salmonellosis, and anthrax would also be some examples of a bacterial disease. Because diseases can kind of fall in different categories. You have those that are caused by viruses, and then you have those that are caused by bacteria. And so how you kind of handle those may depend on what type of disease you're dealing with. So another one that we've kind of mentioned briefly in the beef lecture before that could be a zoonotic disease would be mad cow disease. And it's a prion-based disease. And so basically all prion means is that there's a protein that's not folded properly. Because if you remember, we talked about proteins and how they have a certain structure. Basically, a prion is when that structure is no longer normal. It's an abnormal structure of that protein, and it can cause a disease, and it can actually turn other normal proteins into prions. So it's a prion-based disease, and in humans, it's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. But it's the same type of disease, that same prion disease that causes mad cow. It just has a different name when it's in people. And so there have been cases throughout history of people actually getting mad cow, or in their case, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, from eating disease from an infected, or meat from an infected cow. So it can happen. The risk today, I would say, is fairly low because we've done a pretty good job of getting mad cow disease under control, but it's good to be aware that it could happen, and new diseases are emerging all the time. Trichinosis is another one, and that's basically a roundworm infection, so that would be the larval stage of roundworms. Cryptosporidiosis would be another emerging highly infectious disease, and it's caused by a protozoan type species, and that will be the Cryptosporidium parvum, which I'm not going to ask you to remember because that's just the scientific name for that organism that's causing that disease. So it can be transmitted from person to person. It can be transmitted from feces from dogs and cats, and then cattle are also a reservoir for that particular organism that can cause that disease. So this disease is pretty intense because the organism is actually resistant to inactivation in the environment. And so it's very hard to kind of deactivate it and get rid of it. And there is no pharmaceutical therapy for that. So it's kind of a hard disease to deal with. So prion diseases, I kind of just mentioned a little bit to you already. So prions are infectious agents that are made of protein. So basically what happens is it causes an abnormal folding of protein, which occurs in the nervous system typically. And so when it's affecting the nervous system, it's going to eventually cause this progressive degenerative brain disease, because it's going to be affecting nerves and movement and a lot of things going on in the brain, because those amyloid proteins are going to be in the brain. So it's also called transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. So it's a mouthful. So it's called bovine spongiform encephalopathy in cattle. TSE is basically what they use in sheep. So again, all the same disease. It's kind of confusing as it has like 4 different names. But just be aware that pretty much anytime you see the spongiform encephalopathy, that's going to be your mad cow disease. So the TSE is kind of the but again, that's kind of the official name that I learned about with sheep. But so under that, you have, if it's specifically in cattle, you've got bovine or BSE or mad cow disease. Scrapie is another kind of general term for it in sheep, just because the whole word is like 3 words is really long to say. So sometimes people just call it scrapie. Chronic wasting disease in deer and elk. If you've ever seen any deer or if you've been around elk and they're just really, really skinny and it looks like they're not eating, it could actually be a chronic wasting disease type of situation that could be caused by this prion disease. Kuru in humans is another example. And then it can affect minks, can affect cats, and then, of course, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans. So lots of different ways that this prion disease can show up in a lot of different species. But basically all of those mean the same type of disease. So mad cow disease, which I know we've mentioned before, but I'll get into maybe a little bit more specifics in this lecture. It's a progressive fatal brain disease of cattle that causes neural degeneration. So again, degeneration of that kind of brain and nervous tissue. There is no treatment for it, so if a cow gets it, it's just only going to get worse until that animal dies. There's really no way to treat it. So it was first observed in the United Kingdom in the late 1990s and then the early 2000s. By 2007, so that's only like a few years later, there were already 11 cases in Canada and then 2 cases in the US. So it had already kind of spread to North America. It was thought to have been spread by feeding ruminant meat and bone meal to calves, because sometimes that happens. Meat and bone meal was is definitely less popular today for this reason. But back then it was popular because meat and bone meal was a good source of protein and nutrients for the animal. But if you're getting that meat and bone meal from a cow that's been processed that had mad cow disease, then those prions could be actually in that meat and bone meal, and then that's fed to another animal. Of the same species. That could be a big problem. So bone meal is basically just a mixture of coarsely ground animal bones and slaughterhouse waste products. So when the animal goes to the slaughterhouse, obviously all of the major parts like the meat and everything are going to be taken out for human consumption. And then with what you have left over is obviously going to be all the things that we don't consume. So that's going to be like the bones, the nervous tissue, and organs and things like that. So those can actually be turned into feed for other animals. So meat and bone meal would contain the BSE prions in the nervous tissue, because meat and bone meal could actually include the brain and spinal cord from animals. And so if they're infected cattle and then you feed it to cattle again, they could get the disease. So it's also thought to kind of spread a lot of diseases now, we've learned later, now that it's 2018. So typically meat and bone meal is not as popular. So symptoms of it would be incoordination, and trouble walking or getting up, which makes sense because their nervous system is going to be affected. So the infected animal may act very nervous or violent even, which is kind of where the term mad cow comes from, because they're kind of acting a little crazy. It kind of makes sense because all of this is, again, affecting the nervous system. So the nervous system is responsible for control and coordination and movement of the body. And if that's being affected, you're going to kind of have trouble walking around and getting up. There's no reliable way to actually test for it in a live cow. So it's kind of one of those things where you can assume that an animal has it just based on the symptoms, but you really won't know if that animal was infected or not until after it's died. And then you can actually look at the brain under a microscope, and you'll be able to see kind of almost like holes, kind of in a way, is what I've been told, in the brain, and then you'll know that that was kind of mad cow. Again, there's no treatment for it. So prevention is key, and it has a very long incubation period. So once an animal, like if an animal eats infected meat and bone meal, it could take 4 to 6 years for a cow that's been infected to actually show symptoms. And so that is extremely scary, because that animal could be completely fine for a very long time and then kind of just all of a sudden get the disease, and you don't really know at what point they ate something infected. Or at what point they really were infected. So kind of a big deal there. And then once a cow shows symptoms, again, it's going to continue to get more and more sick until it's going to die eventually. And typically that could take anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months. Just kind of depends on the animal. So again, like I said, there's no treatment, so prevention is the key. So the U.S. government has several approaches to prevent or at least reduce it in the U.S. And so actually it's not in the U.S. right now. I haven't heard of any cases of it anytime recently. So we do a pretty good job of this. So the FDA does not allow most parts from cows and certain other animals to be used in feed that will be fed back to cows. So because cows are ruminants, cows no longer get feed from any other ruminant. It doesn't happen. So they won't get meat and bone meal anymore. So the USDA also makes sure that those parts that are at high risk for transmitting the disease, which would be the brain and spinal cord, and that cows showing any symptoms are not used to make food for people or other animals. So those animals will be discarded, and then the tissue that could possibly be infected, even from cows that are seemingly healthy, are not used for human consumption or other animals. The USDA actually samples around 40,000 animals per year. And from what I've understood, that's kind of a random sampling. They just kind of want to see if it's popping up anywhere. But they will test for that per year. And then also another way they can prevent it is by stopping imports of live animals or animal products from countries that actually have BSE. And I will definitely say that they do this. When I've come back from being over in another country, you get a questionnaire, and they ask you, are you bringing back any meat products? And they want to know exactly where you are. Or even for other diseases, like were you on a farm? So they do take it very seriously, because once it gets here, it can be a big problem.
If I can jump in, just it clicked in my brain. Apparently back in August, they found a cow in Florida.
Oh,
And it's only the 6th case of mad cow that's been in the United States in the last 15 years since they started locking all of this down.
yeah, yeah. So
But there was one in August that
okay.
was, and I quote, found unsuitable for slaughter.
Yeah. Oh, geez. Yeah, I didn't hear about that. That's scary. It was just one?
Yes, it was just the one. I mean, I just sort of remembered hearing it, and I just pulled up an article, but I'm like, I haven't read it yet. But didn't hear much follow up about it, so it may have just had some indications or symptoms, but
yeah,
maybe
it's
not
kind
too
of
bad if it's only one.
right. You would think if one got it, that there would definitely be others in that herd that would have it or be infected. But yeah, I don't know if that's scary. But I've heard of that too, where like just randomly like one case will pop up here and there, and it's kind of weird. But yeah, I didn't know that there had been one that recently. So
Yep.
good to know.
I was kind of surprised when I heard about it.
Yeah, for real. Does anybody have any questions on mad cow disease before we move on?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, do you think it's caused by cannibalism?
Like cause, is that the only cause?
Well, I mean, that's just, I thought, because it's just a weird disease, I guess. It's just, they get it by eating their brains, basically, of other cows.
Right.
I don't know, that's why I was just asking a question.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's basically that's how it spread. So I mean, in like a normal situation, like I'm trying to think, like if cows were out in the wild.
Yeah, I think I've heard of cases where it's like the same in monkeys, where they eat other monkeys and they get the same type of disease.
Yeah, it can definitely happen.
It's like we have some weird genetic code in there that where over a certain period of time they're eating their own species or something just doesn't click in the brain anymore.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it's something that some species kind of do. Of course, cows do it more because as humans, if we're raising them, we were feeding them the meat and bone meal. So whether cows would choose to do it in, like the wild, probably not, because they'd be eating more, grass and things like that. Because meat and bone meal kind of was a supplement type thing that we were giving them in production, that humans were kind of controlling. But you're exactly right. Some species will actually do that. Like chickens, for example, will sometimes peck each other. Like if one of them is bleeding or something, like I've seen them just kind of go at it and they'll start pecking at each other. And it's kind of cannibalistic in a way. It's almost like they don't realize that that's your same species.
It's probably more of a second predator situation where like a coyote takes down a cow or a calf or something like that, and then this other cow just happens to come along and eat in the area where that incident happened and where the carcass had been.
And you have those cases, but then you have like the tiger shark, which eats the strongest embryo eats the other embryos, which is crazy. So it's just weird.
Yeah, weird things like that happen in nature. It's kind of crazy, and lots of different species have different kind of things. But yeah, I would say like what Tom said, like if cows were kind of just left alone, that would kind of be a secondary situation. Like I don't think the cow's not going to attack another cow and then just for the purpose of eating it. But it is kind of cannibalistic in the way that they are eating meat from another animal of their same species.
Well, that's what I just figured it started from something along those lines, is that the animal isn't supposed to be eating the brain and bone parts of the same animal.
Right, yeah. And yep, exactly. Any other questions? Yeah. So now we're going to talk a little bit about viruses, and viruses can kind of be a little complex because you can have a bunch of different types of viruses. So basically, viruses can have either DNA or RNA as their genetic material. So remember, DNA is transcribed transcribed to RNA, and then RNA is translated to protein. But DNA and RNA are both genetic codes and both genetic material. So viruses can have either or as the form of their genetic material. So there's a system that basically assigns viruses to one of 7 groups based on the form of DNA or RNA. And so I'm not going to ask you to memorize all of these. This is just the list showing you how many different types of viruses that you can have. And depending on what type they are can kind of depend on how fast they can kind of adapt to the environment and spread and things like that. So you can have double-stranded DNA, or you could have single-stranded DNA, and then same for RNA. So lots of different combinations. So just important to kind of know that not all viruses are exactly the same, and they don't all work the same way. So some viral diseases that we'll just kind of touch on. Some in dogs would be distemper, rabies, parvo, foot and mouth disease, which we've talked a little bit about in the cattle lecture, I think. And then avian influenza would kind of be some viral diseases. Distemper can be a major cause of death in puppies. And so it can cause fever, loss of appetite, vomiting, coughing, and then a discharge from the eyes and nose. And so vaccines can prevent this. So if you get a new puppy and you take it to the vet for its 6-week shots, they're going to give it a vaccine for this, because it can be a really big deal for puppies. Rabies, of course, is a really big one when we think of viral diseases. It's a viral disease of mammalian species. So it's not necessarily going to affect fish or anything like that. It's kind of specific to mammals. So typically we think of rabies in bats. It can happen to dogs, foxes, raccoons, skunks, as well as people. And it's spread primarily through animal bites. So if you're seeing an animal that's acting weird, or if your animal, your dog or whatever, has attacked an animal that came into the yard, that actually happened to me. My dogs went after a raccoon that ended up having rabies. They were up to date on their shots, but we had to have them quarantined for 30 days. So anytime you think that anything around you has been around a rabid animal, or you have, it's important to take proper precautions because it can be fatal. So symptoms would be a change in behavior, aggressiveness, the animal could be reluctant to eat or drink, hypersalivation, so that's kind of why you think of the foaming at the mouth, is kind of typically what people call it, paralysis, and then the disease will progress very rapidly, so within days it's full-blown to the point of no return. It is almost always fatal in humans and most animals. So it is extremely important that you don't try to be around any animal that you think has had it. And as much as you want to still be around your dogs, if they've kind of gone after an animal, it's extremely important to quarantine them, because if they get rabies, they're not going to distinguish that you're their owner. They'll just bite you anyway. And then you have to get the vaccination or the rabies shot afterwards, and it's extremely expensive. So rabies vaccinations are required for dogs and cats in the U.S., and that's because typically a lot of them are outside. They could come into contact with animals that are carrying it. So you want to make sure that your animals are vaccinated. If you actually work with animals a lot, it may be a good idea. I know that NC State required me to actually have my rabies vaccination because I work with pigs, and other animals could actually get in the swine barns. So there was a small risk, but there was a risk nonetheless. So I did the whole series of rabies shots, which actually paid off because I had some wild animals show up in my apartment one time through the dryer. So I was like, I'll take one for the team. I've had my rabies shot. But so, yeah, it's always just good to kind of be aware, because rabies is still out there, and one bite could end up being fatal if it's not taken care of. So foot and mouth disease, which I think we've touched on a little bit before. It's also known as hoof and mouth disease. So same thing, because like cows don't really have feet, they kind of have hooves. So same disease. It's a very contagious viral disease that typically affects cattle, pigs, and sheep. So mostly animals with the divided hooves. So if you think about a cow or a sheep hoof, then that kind of makes sense. So it does not affect horses, dogs, or cats, because if you think about a horse hoof versus a cow, they're different because cows is kind of divided. And then obviously dogs and cats don't really have hooves, and so it doesn't affect them either. So North America has been foot and mouth disease free since 1954. As far as I know, Tom, we'll turn it over to Tom. Any reports on foot and mouth disease?
He's not here, but I remember when I was in high school, we had an outbreak of it.
Really?
Yeah, and a whole bunch of kids were getting it. Like, it's kind of like, looks like chicken pox almost, I guess. It's just a whole bunch of red bumps on your hand and feet, right? 'Cause that's
Kind of, yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's what people were getting.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, I didn't hear about that, but yeah, we'll kind of. I think I may have some pictures. Yes, I have some pictures on the next slide. So at least in livestock, I haven't heard too much about more outbreaks. There was a significant outbreak in the United Kingdom in 2001 with 7 million animals that were actually culled. So that was a large economic loss because that's a lot of animals and it can spread very rapidly. Vaccines are available and can be used in countries where foot and mouth disease is prevalent. However, it must be matched to the subtype. So you have the initial virus, but then you can kind of have different versions of that virus. That would kind of be your subtypes. So you want to make sure if you have a specific version of that virus, that the vaccine is targeting that particular subtype.
They said you had a question for me while I was gone.
Oh, I was just saying if you had heard of any recent foot and mouth disease outbreak.
No, I haven't.
You're my go-to source on that now.
Oh my. You're in trouble now.
Yeah. So symptoms of foot and mouth disease would be a fever and then blisters on the tongue and lips, obviously it's foot and mouth disease, so it's going to show up in those areas. So you're going to see these blisters in and around the mouth, could see them on mammary glands, and then of course around the hooves. And so you can kind of see this picture that's pretty gross, and it looks extremely painful. So those blisters that are called vesicles can pop and then turn into these red areas that are called erosions. So those red areas would be what you see in this picture. So the pain and discomfort that these are going to cause is going to obviously lead to other symptoms such as depression, anorexia, excessive salivation, so lots of saliva, lameness, and then reluctance to move or stand. Because if you can see this picture of what's going on in the mouth, you imagine that going on with the hoof. Eventually that animal is not going to want to get up because it's going to be extremely painful. So most animals that are affected will not actually die, but the disease will leave them very weak, and then they'll be unable to really produce milk and meat the way that they did before, because they're just going to be so weakened from that disease. So unlike mad cow disease that could be incubating for 4 to 6 years, foot and mouth disease will happen pretty rapidly after that animal is infected. So illness could appear within 2 to 14 days after infection. So it's kind of a quick turnaround.
Yeah, and I just found out that if you just look it up in Virginia, they said that they've been having outbreaks of, they call it hand, foot, and mouth.
Yep, I have heard that.
So I guess that slide isn't right anymore because we've had an outbreak of it, or at least some people are getting it. But,
yeah, so all of those are mostly in people, you said? Yeah. So as far as I know, I don't think there have been any outbreaks in livestock, which is kind of, yeah. But I didn't realize that there had been outbreaks in people. That's kind of scary. Good to know. Thanks. So avian influenza is another viral disease. It's caused by one of a series of viruses, and the disease can affect poultry, game, as well as wild birds. So it's not just specifically to like chickens. or specific to chickens or anything. It can affect wild birds as well. A lot of diseases actually start in wild populations of animals, and then they can get into commercial systems. So migrating birds can spread the disease to different regions, obviously, because birds that migrate, if they have it, they're in one area, then they're going to migrate to another area. And so that's going to carry that disease to a whole different area really fast. Influenza in people and domestic animals. So avian influenza viruses, that V should not be there, horrible typo, can mutate into forms that can be pathogenic to people and or domestic animals. So viruses kind of can be super contagious and really hard to control sometimes because they can mutate really fast. And they can mutate into forms that can start infecting other species. So that's something that can happen in the case of influenza. So it's really good to be cautious. And like even with the flu, because I'm going to swine farms, I have to have my flu vaccination, not so much because they're concerned about me, but because I could actually transmit it to the hogs. So definitely stuff to be aware of if you're producing livestock or going on farms. So you have a question?
There's actually been a couple of cases with Purdue chickens, avian influenza getting spread around. I know it killed off a couple of whole houses before.
Oh, yeah.
So we've been taking extra caution to avoid that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where it goes back to biosecurity. And sometimes even with all the biosecurity in place, it can still happen. I mean, if it's in a wild bird and a bird gets close to that house, it's like it's hard to prevent. But yeah, it can, if it infects, a couple birds in a house, it could spread through that house really fast. So it can be kind of hard to control. So it may be transmitted directly from birds or through an intermediate host, such as a pig. So it can kind of go through all different species and get transmitted that way. Swine flu. In 2009, there was a new influenza that was identified in people. I don't know if you all would remember it, but I definitely remember this. This was the year I graduated high school, and I remember the swine flu and everything was in the news all the time. So it was originally referred to as the swine flu, basically because the genes that were found in this virus were similar to the influenza virus that normally happens in pigs. So it was actually happening in people as well, but the genes were similar to the version that typically happens in pigs. So that's kind of where the term swine flu came from. So it was thought that the virus actually came from sort of a reassortment of genomes from viruses that were endemic in pigs, birds, and people. And so viruses can kind of, swap genes. I don't really know how to explain it without getting too scientific, but basically they can kind of reassort genomes and get genes from other virus types and then just really, really mutate. So it's kind of scary. So this could happen, for example, when two different types of viruses infect the same cell, and they're both in that cell and they're using that cell to replicate, they can actually exchange genes. So one virus that maybe didn't have a certain gene before can actually get that gene from another virus that's occupying the same cell. And then that will completely change both of those viruses to kind of a new version of that virus. And it can typically make them worse and harder to get rid of. Any questions on that? Okay. So bacteria can also cause disease. So bacteria are just a very simple microscopic life form. So they're called prokaryotes if they do not contain a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. So eukaryotes would be the term if you're thinking back to high school biology, if they do have a nucleus. So the way I remember that is pro equals no. So prokaryotes, no nucleus. Don't know if that helps you at all, but that's what my biology teacher taught me, and it's stuck. So prokaryotes, no nucleus. So they use DNA as their genetic material. However, they're not going to have a nucleus, so the DNA is kind of just going to be in the cell. It's not going to be contained within a nucleus. And so diseases that could be caused by bacteria like this would be mastitis, shipping fever, Lyme disease, and then bubonic plague. And then also foodborne diseases that are caused by bacteria such as salmonella and listeria are still big deals. Salmonella especially, you hear about outbreaks like all the time. I heard of some actually, I think it was with turkeys recently. There was a salmonella scare. But the article was weird because it said like people eating like salmonella, they were getting salmonella from raw turkey meat. And so then my question was, why are you not cooking it? It was weird. The whole article made it sound like people were eating raw turkey, and it was very strange. But so just something to be aware of. So again, like I said, prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. Prokaryotes are going to be kind of this top left, so where you're going to have the DNA just kind of loose in the cell in a way. It's not going to be contained in a nucleus. And then these types of cells are usually propelled by a flagellum, so that's kind of just this long, like, tail-like structure. And then eukaryotic cells would be like cells that are found in plants and animal cells. So this would be an animal cell down here, if you can see my cursor with the kind of purple around it. And then a plant cell is going to have a cell wall. So animal cells do not have a cell wall, plant cells do. So just to kind of refresh your memory so that when I'm talking about prokaryotic cells, you kind of remember what I'm talking about. The parasites can also cause disease. So a parasite is just an organism that lives in close proximity to an animal and completely depends on that animal. So it will receive nutrition from the host until or using the host blood and absorbing nutrients in the host intestine. So a lot of parasites will actually be intestinal parasites that get into the digestive system from the animal that's like grazing, for example. There are a lot of parasites in the soil. They can be ingested by the animal, and then they can actually infect the digestive tract and just kind of live in the digestive tract and get nutrients from the host. So obviously these would adversely affect the quality of life for companion animals and livestock. It would reduce the production efficiency of livestock and could actually result in the death of the animal if it's not taken care of. So internal parasites, protozoa are kind of a category of these. So that would be a single-celled eukaryote, so it would have a nucleus and organelles. And these can impact livestock and companion animals as parasites, actually zoonotic diseases, and by symbiotic ciliates that participate in fermentation in the rumen. So you can have some protozoa that kind of have a symbiotic relationship, which would be a beneficial relationship. So it's not completely always bad, but typically if you're going with the term parasite, that implies a negative relationship and that is harming that animal. And that would just include some of these organisms like Coccidia and then Giardia intestinalis, which is just a scientific name for basically Giardia. Which can live in like water and things. Like if you go camping and you just like drink out of a river, that's the possibility you could get that. So just be aware that the bacteria are kind of all over the place. So coccidiosis is caused by Coccidia, so pretty easy. It's pretty much named right after the organism that causes it, like a lot of these diseases are. And so this is when there are internal parasites of the intestinal cells. Coccidia, that specific bacteria, would be an intestinal parasite. So coccidiosis in poultry can be a big deal. It can have significant impacts on performance and production. So it can increase mortality, and that should say morbidity. There should be an R there. Or sickness, like we talked about, reduced growth, and then poor feed conversion. And feed conversion is important because that's how efficient that animal is at growing based on how much feed you're giving them. So if they have reduced feed efficiency, you're going to have to feed them more to get the same amount of gain, and that's going to cost more. So it's important to know. So coccidiostats are an anti-protozoal agent that can act upon Coccidia parasites to kind of prevent that. So something to be aware of. So these slides are always like pretty gross to talk about. So I actually put a little like cartoon type picture on here because some of the real pictures get pretty gross. And since this class is right before lunch, I didn't want to completely kill your appetite. So just some intestinal parasites or internal parasites that you could have or that an animal could get would be intestinal roundworms. So large numbers of these intestinal roundworms can actually give a puppy like a pot-bellied appearance, and then a failure to thrive. So if you have an animal that's not doing well, and if you have a little puppy that's got like a really, really big belly, that might be something you want to check. It could cause diarrhea or vomiting, or in extreme circumstances actually cause an intestinal blockage because you're going to have so many of these worms there. In horses, you would have reduced growth and potential blockage as well. And so strongyles or strongyles, I'm not actually sure how you say that word, so however you want to say it's fine, are bloodworms or redworms that live in the blood vessels of horses. And so these can actually cause anemia because they damage the blood vessels that are in the intestine and can cause bleeding into the intestine, which would lead to a loss of weight due to damage to the intestine, because if the intestine's damaged, you're not going to be absorbing nutrients from the feed, so you're not going to grow. And then it can also cause colic or intestinal ulcers. So parasite prevention is extremely important because they can be treated most of the time, but as always, you want to start with prevention because that's better than trying to treat something after the fact. So internal parasites can be a problem in many animals, particularly grazing livestock, so like cows, sheep, horses, because they're kind of out there in the soil, and there are a lot of parasites that live in the soil. So if you have animals that graze, you really want to be aware. There can be a lot of economic losses from these parasite infections, and those losses can be significant. So good management practices can reduce the losses that you would see from parasite infestation. Good management practices would be like deworming, especially if you have like cattle or sheep, kind of being aware of what parasites are in your area and make sure that you're doing things to reduce those. Younger animals are more susceptible to parasites, and that's typically because older animals have been exposed to the parasites for longer, so they may actually be able to build up a small degree of immunity. That doesn't mean that they're not going to get infected or they'll be able to fight them off completely, but they may have a little bit of immunity because their body has kind of seen that organism before, so it may make it a little harder for that parasite to actually infect an older animal. So like I just talked about, parasite prevention, one of the things that I mentioned was deworming, also known as just worming or drenching. So people kind of have different terms for it. In sheep, I typically hear it referred to as drenching. And so basically this is when an anthelmintic drug or a dewormer is administered to a human or animal to rid them of these parasitic worms, such as roundworm, flukes, and tapeworm. So the type of dewormer and the administration level and the deworming schedule may all depend on the specific farm and the management practices that are present on that farm. It could also depend on what type of parasite is found in that area. If there's more roundworms that are typically found than other types of worms, you may want to kind of keep that in mind. When you're choosing a dewormer, you want to make sure that it's covering the parasites that your animals are going to be exposed to. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you have the proper deworming schedule, and then that you're always giving the proper dose, because you don't want to give the animal too much, but you also don't want to give too little, so that it's not going to be effective. So all different things to consider. So other intestinal parasites, roundworms or nematodes, heartworms. If you have any companion animals, that's typically where you would hear about heartworms. And this picture, as you can see, is extremely gross. So when the vets do pitch heartworm prevention, definitely listen because it's a big deal. So heartworms can be found in the heart and blood vessels in the lung, and they will reduce the host ability to exercise, which will cause a loss of weight, and ultimately it can cause death from congestive heart failure, because as you can see, eventually it will get to the point where there are so many worms in there that the heart will fail, and that animal will die. So it's a serious thing if you have companion animals that go outside a lot. So heartworm prevention for dogs and cats. I strongly recommend it because treating heartworms can be extremely expensive if your animal gets them. So it's always good if you have an animal that's outside to have them on some sort of heartworm preventative, because all it takes is one mosquito bite from the wrong mosquito. Pinworms can reside in the cecum and colon of horses, so just another type of intestinal parasite. And then other internal parasites, flatworms or tapeworms would be an example of that, live in the intestines of the primary host. So the head will actually embed itself in the upper small intestine using like hooks and suckers, which is really, really gross to think about. These intestinal parasites always kind of gross me out talking about it. Flies can cause fly strike, particularly in sheep, which we've talked about before, where the flies are going to be attracted to the feces and then eventually you're going to have maggots. Bot flies are true flies with a parasitic stage of development. So they can lay eggs on the skin of a horse, and then that can actually be transferred to the mouth, and then through the mouth it's going to eventually get to the intestines. So that can be a big problem. And eggs of bot flies are also infectious to people as well. So it's not just infecting your animals. So deworming would be an example of an internal parasite prevention. There are external parasite preventions. So like, for example, to keep bot flies off your horse. Pour on chemicals, there are a lot of different options, but you want to make sure that it's a good one. Typically with pour on chemicals, you just want to be a little bit careful because it is a chemical that you're pouring on your animal. And so some animals could be slightly sensitive to that. Vet gun will actually shoot capsules that are filled with insecticide that will burst upon contact. So when the animal is hit with that capsule, it will burst and spread this insecticide through the animal's skin and hair. And it eliminates the need to process through a chute. Like if you have an animal that's really hard to handle that you can't get through a chute, you can get a vet gun and you can shoot at it with one of these capsules. I always find that very interesting. It's one way to do it. So frequent pasture rotation is another one. And that's really good because it allows the manure that's in that pasture to dry, which will decrease the flies. If you leave animals in a pasture for too long, you're going to have so much manure there and so many flies that it's just going to increase your parasite problem. So you always want to make sure that you have a good pasture rotation plan in place to give that manure time to dry and hopefully cut down on some of the parasites. Other external parasites, such as ticks and mites, can live on the skin of animals and exist by sucking the blood or the use of dead skin. So some examples would be the American dog tick, deer tick, lone star tick, mites, and then poultry mites, which would be specific to poultry. Other insects, lice, can be blood-sucking or chew on the skin. Blood-sucking bugs, blood-sucking true flies, which would be like mosquitoes, and that other type of fly I'm not even going to try to pronounce. So there are some other diseases while we're talking about diseases in general. We talked about infectious diseases, which would be diseases that are caused by a virus or a bacteria or something along those lines. However, there are other diseases that can happen that are non-infectious, meaning they can't be spread to other animals or to humans or anything. They can particularly affect, one animal, or they have a different cause other than a bacteria or virus. So these would be like diseases with nutritional, metabolic, or stress-related causes. It could also be diseases that have a genetic cause. There are a lot of diseases that can be caused by genetics alone that are not infectious and it can't be transmitted to other animals or people. An example of this would be ascites. So that's actually a metabolic disease in poultry that causes a lot of fluid to build up in their body cavity. And so that makes them unable to supply their tissues with enough oxygen. And they will have a very flaccid but enlarged heart in this situation. So it can be a very dangerous situation in poultry, and that is a metabolic disease. Obesity in companion animals, we touched on before, really big issue. It predisposes the animal to other health problems later on. Nutritional management is the key. Be careful with treats that you're giving your dogs or cats. If you're giving them treats, you want to cut back on the amount of food that you're giving them. Or if they're getting a lot of people food, you want to cut back on the food that you're giving them. Labels on feed bags will have a guide to how you should feed your animal. I know a lot of people don't look at those. Really, actually, before I started getting into animal nutrition, I was one of those people. I didn't look at it either. I just kind of gave them almost as much as they wanted to a certain extent. But there are labels that will have a guide. So it's usually based on how much your animal weighs. So if you've been to the vet recently or you kind of have an idea, it'll tell you, like, if they're 50 pounds, they get 3 cups or whatever. And so this is important because not all feeds have the same nutrient content. So if you have, like, a feed that's a little bit cheaper, that maybe doesn't have as much protein, you're going to need to feed more of that feed to the animal. And then let's say the next time you go to the store and you buy a different brand that maybe has a little more protein, you're not going to want to give the animal the same number of scoops that you've always given it because it's got different nutrient content. And a lot of times people don't realize that, and that's how animals can become obese very quickly because suddenly their owner bought a different type of food, but they're feeding them the same amount, but that food has way more calories in it. Just something to be aware of if you have pets. So you may be able to feed less of high quality feeds. So if you're in the store and you're trying to decide like what dog food to buy, for example, cheaper may not always be better. You may be able to find one that's a little bit more expensive, but that you can actually feed less of. And so they could end up being about the same cost. So just something to think about. Milk fever is another metabolic disease that can occur in cattle. Typically, it occurs at the transition period between late pregnancy and then early lactation. And so what it does is it causes hypocalcemia, which is low calcium, or so reduced concentrations of calcium in the blood. And so calcium is extremely important, especially with milk production, obviously, because a lot of calcium is going into the milk. So this could be a big problem in cattle in general, but particularly dairy cattle are where you're going to see milk fever more often. So a common treatment that's used to prevent it would be the injection of calcium borogluconate just before or just after calving. So basically it's just going to give that cow a large dose of calcium right at that time period where she would be susceptible to milk fever, and then that should prevent it. So the calcium just provides a reservoir to increase the blood calcium right at the time that it's needed for milking colostrum. So basically what I just said. So just giving them a huge dose of calcium right at that time when they're susceptible to it. So the problem with this, though, is that it may not last long enough, this injection of the calcium borogluconate. So milk fever could still actually occur before the calcium regulating mechanism of the cow starts working efficiently. So it's a way to prevent it, but it's not a very long-lasting prevention, I'll say. So if you have a cow that you think may get it or showing symptoms, then you want to just be aware and kind of have calcium borogluconate on hand. Other non-infectious diseases that I'll just mention that are related to metabolism, aging, or mental health would be cancer, osteoarthritis, heart disease, endocrine diseases, anxiety or confusion, dementia, some skin diseases, and then obesity, or just kind of some others to be aware of. And all of these I mentioned because they can happen in animals, but particularly the ones related to aging we think of with companion animals because we don't have livestock around typically long enough to see those types of problems unless it's in a breeding animal or something. That's my last slide. Does anybody have questions on any of that? No, it was a lot of information. All good? Okay. Well, y'all have a good rest of your week, and I will see you next week.
Okay, before you leave, let's see. Faith, Megan, you said you're going to meet me in Keysville. Colt, are you going to meet me in Keysville Friday? Are you going to make the live?
Yeah.
Okay. And Faith, you said you're going to be there Friday too?
I'm gonna drive.
Oh, you can drive. Okay. Cool. Let's see. Yusef and Berkeley, are y'all going to drive? Y'all going to make it?
I'm gonna probably drive. Berkeley's actually here.
Okay. Okay. And why you said you were going to be here? Okay, Logan, you gonna be here? Okay. No, you're not. Okay, fine. See y'all, whatever that day is, Friday. Drive safe. Oh, did she break out steps in Keysville?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, bye. Merry Christmas. Drive safe in the snow.